We at the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast are saddened by the wildfires that have enveloped the Los Angeles region. We extend our sincere sympathies to those that have lost family members in the fires. We'd like to extend a thank you to the firefighters, the volunteer workers, and all those nonprofit organizations that have stepped up to help those that are homeless. We thank you. Our podcast is here to share knowledge as Los Angeles moves forward with adapting and creating safer environments for the future. Our hearts go out to all of you from all of us here at the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast. Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast. I'm Eva Monheim.
And I'm Hal Rosner. We are both certified arborists through the International Society of Arboriculture. The purpose of our podcast is to encourage tree planting and proper tree care for our urban forests, which include neighborhoods, parks, and other open spaces.
We will also cover a myriad of tree topics, including the important role trees play in relationship to the climate crisis. Thank you for joining us. The Plant a Trillion Trees podcast is happy to announce that we have won 2 Garden Communicator International Silver Laurel Medal Awards for Best Podcast and Best Podcast Episode. We've also won a Garden Communicators International Gold Laurel Medal Award for a Best Podcast Episode. We'd like to thank Garden Communicators for their recognition.
Verdant Earth Educators provides dynamic in-person training and online learning opportunities for environmental and horticultural businesses. Owned by ISA-certified arborists and former university faculty, the Verdant Earth Educator team provides consultations on tree care and recommends climate-resilient opportunities for your valued green spaces. Verdant Earth Educators is all about seeding knowledge for success. Find Verdant Earth Educators at verdanteartheducators.com.
Monheim Microphones designs and handcrafts top-tier studio microphones and preamps right here in the United States in Hollywood, California. Their incredible line of innovative microphones and designs are used around the world by everyone from podcasters to top-charting record producers and singers. Monheim Microphones, unparalleled excellence. MonheimMicrophones.com. The Urban Wood Network gives people strength in numbers and a collective voice to showcase the growing environmental impact of an industry like urban wood utilization. This is really critical in a world where resource recovery and carbon storage benefits can go a long way to meet the needs of climate sustainability goals of cities, businesses, and consumers. Contact us at urbanwoodnetwork.org. This podcast is being recorded on November 1st, 2024. Bestselling author Randi Minetor writes for the Birdfinding and Best Easy Bird Guides series for Falcon Guides Globe Pequot Press and is the author of Backyard Birding and Butterfly Gardening for Lyons Press. Her most recent book, The Complete Language of Birds, is an encyclopedia that unites classic illustrations, science, folklore, and mythology about more than 400 bird species around the world. She writes for Birding Magazine, is a regional report editor for North American Birds, and has served for 3 years as president of the Rochester Birding Association in New York State. Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast, Randi. We're delighted that you could be with us today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Eva. I really was looking forward to doing this.
Well, Hal and I always are looking for people who have a really interesting background, character, and I know you reached out to us from your company through the publisher. But when I saw this, and I said to Hal, we have to have Randi on because it's a birding book. And of course, we're struggling here on the East Coast with birds not knowing what to do anymore. They're like, do we travel? Do we not travel? Are we going to have interference on their migratory trails? is there going to be food along the rest stops?
Right.
These are all the things I think about. But your book is really amazing. And we wanted to find out how you wound up, number one, being a birder, an avid birder, a professional birder, but also coming up with the idea for this book.
Well, it's interesting that the book itself was actually an assignment. An editor came to me with it, but it couldn't have been better suited to my passions and interests. So I was just delighted to have this opportunity to work with Quarto and to create a book at this level, of this caliber. I became a birder back in 1988 when I left my full-time job in the theater. I had been the public relations and marketing director of a theater, the Regional Professional Theater here in Rochester, New York. And it's all consuming, that's how theater is. So when I made the move to the private sector and suddenly had all my evenings and weekends free, I was really at a loss. I had no hobbies. I didn't know how to spend my time. And my husband grew up with his mom being a birder. So they spent time in the outdoors and had traveled all over the country. And he said, you might enjoy birding. So we put up one little bird feeder on our apartment window, and that day we got house finches. I had never seen house finches before, and they're pink. So it was very exciting to have that. And I was hooked. I started going on field trips. I joined the Rochester Birding Association, where I'm now president. So it was the ultimate thing to replace my passion for theater with my passion for birds.
And was that a raspberry finch or was it a pink finch?
It was a house finch.
It was a house finch. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm still very confused with the birding world. I know my birds when I see them. I know who they are, what they look like when I hear them, but to know all their names, I don't.
Sure. No, I understand that. We have two very similar finches in the United States. We have house finch, which have the pink head and breast, right, and a pink rump. And then we have the purple finch that looks like it's been dipped in raspberry juice.
Yes, exactly.
So they're very similar, but honestly, when you see them side by side at a feeder, there's no question about which is which.
Right.
Is the house finch a local or import?
Kind of a little of both. It was a Western United States bird, and the pet trade brought them into the East to breed as pets, essentially. And that wasn't working out very well. And apparently one day, one pet shop released all of its house finches into the wild, and they thrived. So we have house finches now all over the country.
You came into birding and writing from the theater. You had a writing background, is that right?
Yes. I have a degree in English and psychology. I started writing when I was 8 years old, and that's all I was ever going to do with my life. So I went into public relations originally because that's one of the ways you can make money as a writer. But honestly, it was miserable. So it was not a field for me. So in 1998, I left the private sector and went into business for myself. And my first book was published in 2002.
Gotcha. Interesting.
And one of the things I think is really fascinating, I saw that you wrote almost 100 books.
Yes.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, The Complete Language of Birds is my 95th book, and I'm working on my 96th right now, and am in negotiations for 2 more. So I'll get to 100 probably in the next couple of years. But yeah, I took a course in college in which we had to write 1 page, 500 words every single day. For 5 days a week. We met every day, and it absolutely changed my life, this one little course, because I developed the discipline of just okay, I've got a deadline, sit down, write something. And over time that became do all your research, then sit down and write something.
I have to say that I like that. You, I started writing when I was around 8 years old also.
Okay.
And it just wrote, like kind of automatic writing, just as it came. I just wrote. But my English degree also required us to write on a daily basis. And I want to tell you something that really makes a huge difference to how you approach anything in life, really.
Yes.
You're looking at a structure and you're looking at a tone. How do you want to be heard? All of that really comes into play when you're writing that paper. So it's going to be 100. I know it's going to be 100 very soon.
Yes. Yes, and everyone will be invited to the party.
Yeah. We're going through an interesting time here in the Delaware Valley, but I think every part of the world is experiencing weather, weather. And, the challenges and the horrific gifts or horrors, actually, there's the better word, that the climate is offering us. What's your general takeaway in terms of these creatures that you know so much about? And how is climate catastrophe impacting them currently, and where do you see it going? I know that's a big, chunky question there.
But nonetheless, it's something that, anybody who's passionate about birding is very, very aware of the difference in what we're seeing now versus what we were seeing 30 years ago, and how quickly the bird numbers are dwindling. Some of it clearly is the increase in storms, the fact that we've had flamingos in New Jersey and, all kinds of crazy things. We had a limpkin, which is a very, very Florida bird, show up here in Rochester last year. So yeah, there's no question that things are shifting. What we're seeing is that when the birds have their broods, the broods grow up and then they start looking for their own territories, and they're going further and further and further afield from where they usually will nest and breed. And usually only about half of all birds born in a year actually make it to adulthood with predation and all the things that can happen to baby birds. And that's normal. But now we're seeing, as birds go further afield to breed, there's less of the food that they're used to having. There's less of the environment that they need. And we're seeing lower numbers. It's a very unfortunate thing that's happening. And it's kind of the quiet thing, because, you take the birds out of the environment and a lot of people stop thinking about them, people who aren't birders. So that's a thing we have to deal with. In particular, shorebirds are really struggling as beaches disappear, and, all of a sudden where they would stop and have this wide open beach, now there's water right up to the residential development, which means they don't stop. And while some birds can fly, 8,000, 10,000 miles in migration, some of them can't. And they need to stop and rest and feed, and they're finding fewer and fewer places to do so. There's actually a whole movement in Georgia to rebuild barrier islands to give shorebirds coming up from South America someplace to stop on their way north to breed. So, yeah, we are seeing a tremendous amount of change, and we have to blame a great deal of it on climate change.
Yeah, and you make a good point. Helene runs roughshod through the south and the southeast, and we see the images of rivers washed out, trees laying on their sides, homes destroyed, but you're not really getting the bird report. And you can only imagine what those numbers are, and the loss of habitat along with everything else, right?
Right, exactly. And loss of habitat. And there are some areas in the Caribbean islands where, while they may not get hit broadside with the hurricane, they get hit hard enough that it takes down trees. And there are some parrots that only breed in one kind of tree. Or there is one parrot that chooses, I think it's the Imperial Amazon, that chooses one tree early in its life and only nests in that tree for the rest of its life. So if that tree dies or gets blown down, that bird stops nesting. And that's a very scary thing when you think about thousands of trees getting uprooted and knocked down by a storm. And suddenly these birds are at loose ends, have no place to breed, so they just don't. And we're seeing some species of parrot that have just dwindled down to 50 or 60 actual individuals.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow. One thing that jumped out when I was looking through the pages, Randi, and I'm going to forget the word and I don't want to look it up while we're talking, but you do a really nice job, bird by bird, going through and like with a covey of crows and what was that section
The
called?
the collective noun. That's the word.
Collective noun, yes. How did you find all that? Because each bird had 3 options there. It was impressive.
Well, there are a lot of those out there. There's no keeper of the collective nouns. Strunk and White doesn't care. AP Style Book doesn't care.
Yeah, right.
So they're mostly colloquial. So
okay.
It was a matter of searching quite a bit. I mean, God bless Google for that kind of thing, that in different areas, like the birds of New Zealand, you go searching for those and they've got all kinds of names that they've given to their birds. So it wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. I can tell you that where there wasn't anything, I just used flock because all birds are a flock of some kind. But I didn't make any of these up. These are all things that are in use somewhere.
Yeah.
My favorite one
I was going to ask.
Yeah, the Durante of toucans. Right? And I think Jimmy Durante would be very pleased.
Yes, so exotic. That's great.
Yes.
Can you give us a little bit about how you tackled the history part of it and also talk about your conservation status and the colors that you use to help the reader to realize that this bird is endangered or this bird's going to go extinct if we don't keep our eyes on it?
Right. Yeah, it was very important to the publisher and to me to make sure people were aware of the conservation status of birds. In all honesty, there weren't as many that were vulnerable or endangered or critically endangered in this book as I thought there would be. Going through, some of them are still of least concern because somewhere in the world, the IUCN, and I can't remember what that stands for right at the moment, but they do the classifications. For example, house sparrow is vulnerable or even endangered in Europe. But of course, we have huge populations of them here in the Americas, so they're not counted as endangered necessarily. They stay on the list as a bird of least concern. But a lot of those least concerned birds are really dwindling down into what's going to be vulnerable or endangered over the next maybe 20 years. So making sure that people were aware that they're reading about a bird that may be in trouble makes it a little more real for people who either don't think about it or didn't hear about the 3 billion birds survey that came out a couple of years ago from Cornell and are not aware of how many birds we are losing year after year after year. So this is one way to bring that to their attention while being entertaining at the same time.
The other thing that I wanted to say is, with all the bird strikes, with all these big buildings and lots of glass, and people come in early morning and they find thousands of birds dead at the base of these skyscrapers.
Yes.
I mean, that alone is very alarming to me. And, we used to pick up birds on our campus when I was working at Temple, and we would send them down to the Academy of Natural Sciences for them to do their studies on them. And it was just so alarming that we have ways to prevent that, and yet it's not happening.
Well, an awful lot of it is not happening because we haven't actually asked the building owners to turn off their lights. Here in New York, they're trying to get a bill passed called the Dark Skies Act, which would just ask these building owners to turn off their lights from 11 p.m. until dawn. How much light do you really need on a big glass building at 11 o'clock at night? So if we can get them to do that, if we can enact that, make it a law, then we should see fewer birds during migration get attracted to those buildings. That's the thing, that the birds will follow light. And, a bird doesn't really know what a building is for the most part. So they just hit this thing square on and break a neck and, they end up on the ground. This is a very solvable problem, and some areas have already done it. Austin, Texas is a model for this. And being right on that central flyway, that's critically important. So we're hoping to get that enacted here in New York, and hopefully it'll move across the country.
What type of organization would be involved at the legislative lobbying end of that? For example, in New York State, is it a collection of groups that work towards getting such legislation passed?
Yeah, Audubon is involved, and I'm sure there are people in the Department of Environmental Conservation up here who have been involved in that. It's sponsored legislation by several of our assembly people and senators. So it certainly has backing. My own organization, the Rochester Birding Association, did a petition over last summer and, collected 2,000 names in hopes of helping this to move forward a little more quickly than it is.
I see. On the heels of that, I'm remembering back a few years where starling populations were out of control. I feel like it was maybe Kentucky or southern Indiana, and farmers were really trying to rein it in, get them under control. Is that generally the perception? Do farmers still have it out for birds? Is there a pest problem that continues to be a factor with crops?
I hear less and less of that.
Yeah, so do I.
Yeah, I actually wrote a piece for Birding Magazine a couple of years ago about the movement out of Vermont, specifically to get farmers to mow their hay fields a little later to preserve the bobolink populations that are nesting in those fields that get completely wiped out. Entire generations of bobolinks just, vanish because a farmer has to mow his field at a certain time to get the hay to be the most nutritious for the livestock. What this organization is working towards is actually paying farmers to plant a little later, mow a little later, give the bobolinks the opportunity to raise their young and get out of the field and then mow. There are costs involved in that. Sometimes they can't get a second crop, in the time required. So they're paying them to leave the field alone.
I got you.
I think that's a really good point, because when I go out and teach, and people want to know how they should mow their meadows that they just created. I say to mow them late in the season, and then they're ready for spring. They don't have to mow in the spring because birds are already starting to nest. Right. And I think it's really critical for everyone who works in the green industry, and we call it the green industry, but I think it's really critical that they know when things should be mowed so that they're not mowing when you're going to lose a whole nest, like you're saying.
Yes, exactly. This came to my attention because at Cornell University, where the venerated Cornell Lab of Ornithology is, there were fields of hay that were growing for their equine studies department. And, all of these ornithologists on campus there saw all these bobolinks and other field birds flying around, and it was going to be great and all that. And then boom, equine studies mowed that and killed everything. So the Cornell Lab started to campaign internally to keep this from happening again. And it did happen again, unfortunately. And that's when it came to my attention, when the message boards started buzzing about what had happened and how outraged they were and how something has to be done. And I thought, wow, here's a story for birding. So raising the visibility of that and the understanding that there are many, many solutions available, that it doesn't absolutely have to be that you have to mow on a certain day and, screw the birds. Making that clear to people is really the best way to start enacting change, and at least, getting people to ask for these kinds of programs.
This is actually a great time to give a shout out to a movement of arborists. So Eva and I are both members and credentialed by the International Society of Arboriculture. And they're the chapter out in the Pacific Northwest, and that was Dr. Corey Bassett, has actually come out with best practices for arborists with wildlife management, with an emphasis on the birds that might be nesting, up in the tree that's either going to be pruned or possibly removed. And I thought, man, that is really looking ahead in a thoughtful way. And because, I don't think traditionally, historically or whatever, the tree care industry necessarily is vigilant or cares that much if there is a nest, up in that tree on a day that it's scheduled to receive some work. So I'm glad we could bring that into the conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny when I see people using their head shears and it's nesting time and they got to get there because it has to look perfect. And I'm thinking to myself, there's a bird sitting there waiting for you to leave so that they can get into their nest because you're head shearing your hedge, or you think it has to be pruned today. And just a week or two and then come in and prune. Just look to see that there's something in there. A lot of people are oblivious to their surroundings.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And, it's not just birders that care about birds. That's the thing. There are plenty of people who would not call themselves birders, but who love seeing the birds in their yard or on their property, and making that connection between what we do as people and what birds do as birds, and how those two things can mesh quite comfortably, is something that is really what has become sort of my mantra, I guess would be the word, as we look at what's happening with birds in the world right now. Also, there are an awful lot of birds that have specific relationships with various kinds of trees, like the imperial Amazon I was talking about earlier, and making sure that they have not only nesting, but also the food they need that they get from that tree, that they themselves perpetuate by eating berries and then defecating the seeds, and how they themselves spread their own food supply and make sure that they themselves sustain it. There's a really nice lesson to be learned there. So I hear about people saying, oh, I cut down that winterberry in my yard because it was so messy. Well, you just took out a whole food supply, for cedar waxwings and robins and blackbirds and lots of other things that eat the berries. So it's an important message to get out there, to leave nature alone and let it take care of itself.
One of the things I do is I talk about assisted migration. And one of the things that I find troubling is our roadways are on the same pathways as migratory trails. And that heat uprising from the surfaces of the concrete, asphalt, etc., shifts the air currents. So we don't really think about that. We don't think about that our roadways could have food sources for birds along them. We're using Roundup to spray our roadways just to keep things off of it. Every time I go on the turnpike, I think, oh my God, why did they have to spray? It's time for the roosts to be eaten and they sprayed it. Like, why?
Right, exactly. And well, I mean, we could go on and on about pesticides and herbicides, for long periods, and the movements that are afoot to do what we can to get rid of the ones that are really injurious to both, birds and human beings. But it's an excellent point that not all habitat should be filled with ultra landscaped to within an inch of its life land. There's an awful lot of mowing that goes on that is really unnecessary, that if some of that grass could just get a little higher, or if it could be mixed with wildflowers and ground covers and things like that, it would be a much more hospitable environment to birds. These things are not difficult, but they're different. And people fear that, not having that manicured lawn.
Right. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the book, The Complete Language of Birds, a definitive illustrated history, Randi. And as I started to get into it, it's always interesting to me how certain birds, the myna, the owl, a lot of times they're connected with messages, and messages of death seems to be kind of a reoccurring theme. And I think we all probably have personal stories of how birds have kind of appeared at significant times. I'll share one for me when I turned 60, or maybe when I turned 50. It's all a blur. Snowy day in February, came home, and there's a sharp-shinned hawk sitting on the fence. So I live in Philadelphia, a fairly urban neighborhood, although a woodland right nearby, right across the street. And the sharp-shinned hawk seemed to have just finished off a cardinal, because they're on this fresh snow, there's a little collection of red feathers. And I'm not a serious bird person, but I thought, okay, think about this.
Right.
What's this bird community telling me? Perchance, did the sharp-shinned hawk make it into your book?
Boy, I got to remember. I think it did. Actually, let me look.
Okay, if you'll indulge me, that would be great.
With all the birds she put in that book, let me tell you, there's a lot of birds in there.
Oh, yeah. But yeah, I should be able to find this one.
I had to look up the bald eagle because I wanted to know the messages from the bald eagle. And I just loved reading some of the passages of these birds, and some of them are so quirky. Some of them are, and I love that quirkiness of it. If people out there love quirky, this is the book that you need to have on your shelf to look at and to read every evening, like just before bedtime, because I was having a great time reading it before bed.
I could see that would be bedtime reading, yeah.
It's bedtime reading, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have the sharp shin specifically.
Okay.
I have the goshawk.
Right. Which
Yes.
is, I learned, is goosehawk, right? Or goss
Right.
is goose. Yes.
Right, right. And the goshawk is the one that Attila the Hun put a painting of on his helmet.
Helmet.
Yeah, so that's something that was very pointed, as a symbol of strength.
Yeah.
But many of the hawks have been credited with not only, strength and agility and all the things you would expect, but being able to carry messages to the gods.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that way older cultures did not necessarily believe as much in prayer as we do today, but more in terms of how do we get the message up to the right God in the pantheon. So they would choose specific hawks to do that. And some other birds. There were some other birds that also fly very high. So that's a very important part of a lot of mythologies.
I thought the motmot was a really cool bird. And the way it has these, like at the tip of its tail, it has these little feathers, and then it's stripped in the middle, and then there's more feathers up above. And
right.
And they go through the story of how it got named that, and the tail, and why the tail looks like that. And whether it's myth or not, it's just really fascinating to find out what people think and how things happen the way they did. That's a really interesting one.
Yeah, the motmot in particular, it usually because of some other bird pulling on its tail, and that's how it lost all of those feathers between the rump and the little tufts on the end. Yeah, there's almost always some battle between it and another bird that was perhaps more vain and more threatened by the beauty of the feathers. So yeah, they're interesting stories that way. But you think about that, this is how ancient peoples defined their world and tried to understand it way before we had science. Back when science was still called philosophy, this is what they were doing to try to explain things. Well, one of my favorites of those is, where did the barnacle geese go over the winter? And, before we understood migration, way, way before the Common Era, certain philosophers, including Aristotle, believed that barnacle geese, these big geese, turned into little barnacles and clung to the side of a boat for the winter. And then in the spring, they would transform once again and become these huge geese. So, well, it's a theory. They had no microscope, so nobody was taking barnacles and actually examining them to question this. But it wasn't until the early 1800s that we understood what migration was. And that birds went to better climate.
Not till then.
So when you think about, all those years when birds disappeared in the winter and came back in the spring, this is one of the ways that they explained that. So yeah, there are lots of fascinating stories like this.
Well, the one bird that I was looking at was the Andean condor. I didn't know that was the biggest bird.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
And all those countries that have their main bird for their country is the condor because it's that well revered in South America.
Exactly.
I was shocked.
Well, that's it. And not like our, California condor, which was, nearly extinct and was raised only in captivity until about 20 years ago. So, yeah, you can understand the reverence for a bird of that size. Stellar sea eagle is another one that appears in a lot of mythology because they are so large and they glide and, their flight really looks miraculous, especially once you see the bird up close and see how kind of clumsy looking it is. But, it gets up there and it soars, and it's easy to understand why they would say this has got to be of the gods.
I'm thinking the little bit I know about how dogs kind of became partners with humans. Do you think there was ever a bird that was courageous to kind of hang out on the fringes of a campfire or a cooking fire and start to pick up scraps and then ultimately would become a pet or domesticated? I mean, I know at some point the falconry or using birds, to help hunt, but any stories come to mind along those lines of the domestication of certain birds?
Not actually. How we got, chickens and turkeys as domestic birds is more of a breeding issue than this kind of coming in towards where people were. There are not a lot of birds that have self-domesticated. as
Okay.
far as that goes. Yeah. In fact, I can't say that I'm aware of any in particular. Yeah.
Yes. Now that you say it, it's like, what bird would want to become friendly and possibly become dinner?
Well, and this is it. That's exactly it. That
Yeah.
eventually, those birds get eaten. So even, the rock pigeon, which is one of the most common birds in the world at this point, they were brought over from Europe as domestic birds for food. And what they actually did was not hang out for that. An awful lot of them escaped. And that's why we have so many pigeons in the Americas now, that they are not a native breed native species, I should say, in any way. And they're very able to breed with other pigeons and doves and create all the hybrid plumages.
I didn't know that. Yeah, there's some crossbreeding done with rock.
Yeah.
Huh.
Right, exactly. So that's an example of birds that didn't want to be domestic, didn't want to stay in captivity, surely didn't want to be eaten. Yeah. So they managed to get away.
There was a group of birds, and my son used to live in Pasadena, and they were called the Pasadena parrots.
Yes.
Parrots of Pasadena. And they were very close to humans all the time, but it was because they wanted their food, like you were saying.
Mm-hmm. Right.
My son had a garden out back, and they hung out in that tree the whole summer. And it's really funny. But they had this horrible scream as a call, and you'd think somebody was being murdered. It was,
yes.
it was crazy. It was crazy.
Well, yeah, and we haven't touched on the pet trade yet, which is a whole thing worldwide that has become a huge problem. But yes, the fact that there are whole colonies in California, in Texas, in Florida of birds that have been released, either by pet owners who later decided, oh, this was a bad idea, or, somehow escaped on their own, being allowed to hang out outside or however they got there. These birds are remarkably resilient and able, if they find a mate, they will raise a flock. And the next thing you know, you've got these flocks of hundreds and hundreds of birds. There's a park in Brownsville, Texas, Oliveira Park, where if you go there at sunset, you will see thousands of red-crowned parrots. Just beautiful, very, very noisy birds chowing down on all of this fruit in the palm trees. It's quite the event to see this, and, completely out of place in Texas, and yet they're thriving.
I think that's really fascinating to think that the birds are resilient enough to, and I guess it's almost like any species. If they want to survive, they're going to find a way.
Right.
And I hate to say that we as humans don't support the birds as much as we could or should, but they're going to find their way anyway. So
yeah, a lot of birds will find a way. Some of them really, unfortunately, cannot.
Yes.
And that's how we end up with birds that are extinct. One area in which that's happening, almost on a yearly basis is Hawaii. We were just there in May, and seeing endemic species in Hawaii has really become very, very difficult because of all of the invasive mammal species and mosquito species that have come into Hawaii mostly from Southeast Asia and, people coming over from there, so that now there are mongoose everywhere. I was amazed at the number of times we came across mongoose as we were birding in Hawaii. And monkeys eat birds. They also eat a lot of snakes, which is good, but they will eat the birds. Domestic cats that were brought over and became, led to, what would you call it, a clouder of feral cats that also are very interested in eating birds and other rodents and things like that. And then add to that the avian malaria that comes over in mosquitoes. So that whole species and groups of species like the honey creepers are being wiped out because they just can't fight all of these things that have shown up. So yeah, many, many, many birds, unfortunately, are not going to survive some of the things that have been done by humans.
I think it was in Wisconsin where they had such a problem with wild cats and people leaving their cats out that they noticed a plummeting bird population. And they started asking people to keep your pets indoors. That's when they started to do a lot of spading on the cats. And they were very aware that there was a very drastic decrease in bird populations. And that's something we need to be aware of.
Yeah, the Cornell study did discover that the number one threat to birds is domestic cats.
Wow. I mean, I knew that, but I have to say, wow, again. I mean, and cats have never been more popular right now.
Right.
It's troubling.
Well, and the thing is, if you keep your cat indoors, your cat isn't going to eat birds. But if you let your cat have the run of the neighborhood, I have this quiet feud with my neighbors who have cats. I have 17 bird feeders in my yard. And in the middle of the city, I have a little bitty yard, but a lot of bird feeders. So I have a lot of birds. And these cats just come over and sit in my yard and wait. And we've gone after them with a super soaker.
Yeah.
We've tried to do things, but the neighbors have no interest in keeping their cats indoors. And that makes for a difficult situation.
Yeah. Sure does.
It's just another one of those things, we've had in the past year kind of a good back and forth with the activists that want to get rid of leaf blowers. And the pushback was always, we don't want to have legislation. We don't want to be told what to do. But the cat thing, it does seem like another situation. Like if you're going to have a cat, if you want to have it outdoors, it's got to be on a leash and a collar, just like a dog would be.
Yeah, and it's a real uphill battle. And I wish I had an answer for that. We're all trying to solve that one.
You talked about Hawaii and invasives. And, of course, in horticulture, it's always part of the conversation. In fact, we had a recent guest that works for the state of New York who previously, before her current position, was managing invasives for the state. And it almost, tongue in cheek, it's like, has someone written a book called Making Peace with Invasives? Because it seems like the genie's out of the bottle at this point.
Oh, Yeah. How do you fight those things? Yeah. I know. I have my annual battle with bindweed.
Sure.
It is never going away.
And my theory is with invasives is that eventually that plant will go extinct in its home country and it'll need to be someplace else. And you were talking about birds that are, the European bird might disappear in Europe, but it's here in the United States. And we view it as a nuisance.
Right.
Like a starling, for example, where they saw the starling populations plummet in Europe and we had them here and they're saying, well, we have too many of them and let's get rid of them. But then you realize that there's a purpose for that too, that movement. And we may not be aware of everything and why things happen. And of course, we sometimes are the biggest problem, humans and our movement and what we bring with us and what we leave behind. And I think that's something that we really need to think about.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, a lot of things happen right under our noses that we don't see are happening, that are accidents, that it's not malicious. Nobody's trying to kill all the birds.
Right.
But some of these things get out of control. One that comes to mind in my book is the Guam rail. This is a little squatty rail, lives in the wetlands. And it was doing fine in Guam, the only place where it's found, until World War II, when the ships would come in and dock there. And there were brown tree snakes that kind of stowed away on these ships that were among things. And they got out, they left the ship and got onto land and started eating this rail. So now there's just one little area in Guam that is protected within an inch of its life to make sure that none of these snakes get into this one compound. And that's where all the Guam rails live now. So, yeah, just things that you just wouldn't expect. I mean, nobody brought over tree snakes and threw them out, go be fruitful and multiply. This is just something that happened, as happens with us with mice and rats.
Well, I was just going to say the rats that came on with the colonists. I mean, the European rat created more problems than anybody could have ever imagined.
Right.
When I was studying over in England, they were talking about, they asked this question, how do you think these things got into our waterway? I raised my hand. I said, ballast. Water was used as ballast. So you bring on the ballast of water and then you go to another port and then you release it. And there's a whole slew of new animals that were never in that area in the water. And then they become invasive. That happens clear across the world. And it's been happening since we've been pioneers and traveling the world in our boats and ships and what have you.
Right, exactly. That's exactly it. The other area that comes to mind like that is, of course, the Burmese pythons in the Everglades that
Absolutely.
are systematically eating not just birds, but every small rodent and mammal. So that we used to go to the Everglades and all kinds of animals were there, and now they're gone. And the long-legged wading birds are pretty much all you see because they're too big for the python to handle.
And that's despite a pretty aggressive python hunting initiative, I think, by
Yes,
the
just
state.
going to say that. Yep.
Yeah. The problem is that a Burmese python has a brood of as many as 60 snakes.
Wow.
So, so the multiplication there is mind-boggling, and it's a real uphill battle until they find maybe something that preys on them.
Yeah, I was going to say there's no predator there for it.
Not so far.
Yeah, that's crazy. Well, I really think that your book has so much to offer. This would be a great book to read to kids before they go to bed. Take a look at this bird. Let's talk about this bird. And the one I thought was really fascinating was the Patagonia gigas, the giant hummingbird.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And I just thought that we always think of hummingbirds as being small, but this one here is a much bigger one, and it's background. And I thought that was really a neat story. So I could see myself reading to kids these little stories about this bird and that bird.
That's a nice idea.
And
Yeah.
What's your favorite bird in this book?
oh my God.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, that would be terrific.
I think if I was a teacher at an elementary school, I would love to be gifted this to read to the kids and to learn about birds. And because you talk about mythology and you talk about, the whole idea of their purpose and their place and what they may even eat.
Mm-hmm.
It gives a child information that is really very fruitful. And I just think it's a wonderful
You
book.
could actually develop curriculum to go along with that.
Exactly. Curriculum with the bird, maybe a native bird from here, like maybe a robin. And then you talk about the holly tree that we have on the property of the school. And we say, here the bird comes back. And when it comes back from down south, it loves to sit in this tree and eat the berries because it's going to get ready to nest. And it needs all those vital nutrients. Like we like to eat fruit in the summertime. This bird likes to eat it when it comes back in the springtime. That kind of thing. And there's nothing like that out there. No curriculum out there like that.
Isn't that interesting? Thank you for the tip on that. That's something I should take up with the publisher.
Yeah. I really do. I think that we've had a couple books on here, John Perlin's A Forest Journey, which we thought kids should have that book from K through 12. There's so much in there that children can learn about that, from this one book. It's a tree Bible. Talks about the whole story of trees and, where they were and how they disappeared and, why we need to act the way we do when we see something that's happening that's wrong for trees, that whole thing. That's what this book brought back to me, that there's the educational component in these books that you put so much love into. And they're short little stories. They're not long stories. These stories about one bird can change a child's outlook on life forever. They become a birder because of it,
And that would be wonderful. That, then I would really feel my job was done.
Right.
If somebody
Exactly.
became a birder by looking at this book. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, I could see this in reading rooms all around the country.
Oh, that's great. That is great. Yeah, I'll have to bring that up with them. I don't know if they do that, but there may be ways to enter that area. That would be terrific.
I have a couple quick things I wanted to ask before we sign off, Randy. If you'll indulge me, what is the latest thinking on bird baths? Is that still being discouraged?
No, it's not. I know there was a concern about avian flu being passed around, but the wild birds or the passerines or the perching birds that would use a bird bath are not contracting this flu. That's mostly still in domestic birds and a few birds of prey, but not in the little birds at this point. So no, bird baths are okay. But you do want to change the water frequently. And, if you don't have some kind of, recirculating feature in your bird bath, you do want to change that water because it still will come up with bacteria and algae and other things.
That's good. Yeah. Because like I said at the outset, I think we just went through October with no recordable rain. And it just makes me think birds would probably appreciate it.
Oh, I think that's a great thing you brought up, Hal. Everybody should have a bird bath now with the dry. It's so dry. And you think, where are the birds getting? They're eating people's plants. But even the deer are eating people's plants because coming in and eating the juicy stuff like sedums and things like that.
Porcelain berry.
Porcelain berry, yeah.
And then getting back to your lovely book, and I hope we talked about it enough because it really has been fun and enlightening. But we didn't talk about the illustrations, and I meant to check the credits when I was looking through it. The illustrations are beautiful. Can you talk a little bit about the process of getting all those images?
Sure. What we looked for, these are all vintage images that we went looking for things in old books, mostly out of copyright. So some of the big plates are Audubon, which it should not be a surprise to anybody. If you look at them, some people will recognize that style right away. But they're from all kinds of different books and magazine articles and libraries of things that it took some real doing to come up with as many of them as we did. And I think there's only maybe 25 of the birds that did not get an image. But they're from a wide range of sources. Most of them I couldn't tell you who they are because they were, used anonymously. Right. But they really do. The publisher wanted sort of a Victorian look to this, that sort of turn of the 19th century kind of feeling for it. And I think they succeeded. We worked together to find all the images, but I think that they really did accomplish what they had set out to do, to give it that kind of classic feeling.
Sure.
I like the message that the publisher created, another new age of enlightenment, because that was an age of enlightenment back then. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to be enlightened again now. In this 21st century, we need to be enlightened. We've gotten so far away from the natural world that being enlightened again and being reminded that these wonderful beings that have wings need attention and need to be loved just as much as people do. And I think that that's the most critical part. And you are the orchestra leader. You are the one who's making it all happen by writing your beautiful books. And I love the fact that it's an A to Z. So if you're an elementary school teacher, they have a whole alphabet in here that you can see. I love that. And I love the color coding, as we talked about earlier, about, the conservation status of the birds so that children can learn about conservation too. And also the collective names versus the symbolic meanings, the possible powers of a bird. I thought that was really fascinating. And also the folklore and facts. So we're not only talking about folklore, but we're talking about facts.
Right,
facts,
exactly.
Truisms. And the culture. Right. So wonderful. We couldn't be happier to have you on our podcast today and to talk about this, because this is all related to the climate crisis, because these are our vectors to get fruit transported and reseeded into our population, into our natural population, which I believe that a lot of people really don't think about. But that guano that falls from the tree when that bird is sitting there, and I always point that out to my students. In fact, last week we were at Andalusia along the Delaware River, and there at the base of this beautiful beach was an American holly coming up. And I said, now, they have a lot of hollies over in New Jersey. That bird only has to cross over the river, sit on that branch, and drop its guano. Mm-hmm. And that's how it got here. And you could tell the story that way. And I think that that's really one of the most important things about the book. I think that, these animals are doing our vectoring. They're carrying our seed.
I think you've summed it up exactly as it is. Thank you, Eva. That was great.
And we can't wait to hear about your next book.
Well, I will tell you, my next book is a little broader topic. It's called The Bear at the Bird Feeder, and it's about really us moving into where animals are accustomed to living and how we can live in harmony with them. So,
that's wonderful.
Yeah, so it's animals in urban areas like the wild turkeys that have taken over part of Staten Island and the black bears that are pretty much every place. And, and we should not be feeding them out of our trash cans, and all of the ways that all the things that are happening and why, and then what we can do to keep the animals safe while keeping ourselves safe.
Wow, that sounds like a great one too.
Oh, thank you.
Well, we wish you the best. And again, much congratulations on this wonderful new book, The Complete Language of Birds, A Definitive and Illustrated History by Randi Minetor. Again, congratulations and best of luck.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
We enjoyed it.
Thanks, Randy.
Take care.
Good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. The Planet Trillion Trees podcast is edited by Andromedan Recordings in Hollywood, California.